the obvious flip side, real implications of this idea that images can heal or make sick, you'd have some kind of theory of propaganda or social control. And I don't know, the great images of the 20th century have probably been largely damaging. Ideas like the German idea of the master race, or the Soviet ideal of Soviet man, or even the American ideal of the Ward Cleaver nuclear family. But I'm not sure, is that what you mean by... I mean, there are all kinds of ways to talk about the way the image is the image and images are impacting on the mass psyche, like just things which occur off the top of my head. The fact that at a certain level now, everyone has seen all these images from the Hubble Space Telescope that show that the universe is very corpuscular, very organic. It's more like what you see in a tide pool or on a dissecting table than what it used to be, which were bright points of light against darkness. So, in a sense, the images of science shift the parameters of the popular imagination. A painter like Alex Gray, do you know his work? Creates a permission to image the human body simultaneously as a biological system, an energy system, a system of Kabbalistic and mathematical energies. Well, science in the 20th century, I mean, and before to some degree, but certainly in the 20th century, has permitted all kinds of imaginary worlds to be entertained in the popular imagination, because most of the explanations of science involve things you can't see, hear, feel, taste, or touch. In other words, electrons, photons, electromagnetic fields, gradients of concentration, a whole conceptual vocabulary, none of which is experiential. And so our minds are permitted, and in fact can't avoid, shifting level and having all kinds of information on one level available on another level, like the popularity of quantum physical metaphors to explain large-scale events in daily life, synchronicity and telepathy and stuff like that. And there are other sources for the image, but every time I go to New York, I was just there before I came here, I go to the Met and to MoMA and see whatever's showing. And modernism, which used to be this like virtual reality that I walked around in all the time, there was nothing but modernism, is now something I visit in a museum. I mean, it's confined inside these buildings to some degree. It's on a pedestal. And I feel, it feels good to me that modernism is over. And what it means to me is that the value of the image has, or I don't know, value, maybe medium. The medium in which the image is most at home has changed from material, paint, wood, glass, steel, plastic, acrylic, to light. And it's a huge watershed. I mean, it's maybe the biggest watershed in the entire career of the image, because since Lascaux forward, it's always been about applying pigment to surfaces. It's always been about material, and now suddenly it's about something else. And then, of course, we could talk about things like the artist's relationship to the public through how the new tools that empower the new art to be created also empower it to be communicated in ways that nobody could ever imagine before. Decommodifying it at the same time that it removes the middleman. So you get the collapse of an academy well, the Academy collapsed 100 years ago, but you get the collapse of any kind of official cultural canon at all. What you have then is like a Darwinian environment of competing styles and images, which it seems to me that's what art has been more and more. You know, there hasn't been a coherent school of any philosophical depth in art since the 70s, 60s. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking about?
What are some of the new tools, do you think, other than applying pigment to page or canvas?
Well, all software, Photoshop, obviously, but then modeling. I mean, the thing proceeds in stages. There's first the manipulation of the painterly image, essentially an electronic canvas that allows you to do all kinds of things with great facility. Then the next level is modeling, to three-dimensionally build objects that can be viewed from any point of view. And then the animation and texture mapping of these things, the placing them into environments, the setting up of tracking paths and all this, which sounds very technical, but the rate of collapse of this toward sheer intuition, so that essentially the tools that allow you to model and animate become almost lead pencil simple, is happening. And, you know, everything electronic is trying to add dimensionality to itself. So the computer that was text-based tends to want to speak. The image that was two-dimensional wants to be three-dimensional. The three-dimensional image wants to move. And, you know, part of acquiring the full initiation of the culture at this point is learning how to do these things, because what it means is you then have tools to communicate your most important thoughts, the ideas that you're willing to take time enough to model and create, are conveyed with real force and power. And right now, of course, it's very clunky, but I think what it means is that the very enterprise of communication among human beings is transforming in some way. And we've been at this for a while. The first telegraph lines were strung around 1819. The telephone became a common object of the upper class around 1900. But the rate of acceleration and the dimensionality and definition and fidelity of these processes all has increased exponentially. So really the task of communication, instead of saying, well, you learn to speak, you acquire 90% of your language skills by age 5, we're just going to have to say you acquire 90% of your language skills by age 30. And by then, you know, you can model, animate, code, all this sort of thing. I mean, human-machine interfacing as a prerequisite to the creation of art has been going on for a long time. It's just going to affect more and more people. Like, you know, how the creation of a movie is such a massive thing in terms of manpower, capital, and technology before you ever get to the story, the actors, and the art of it. But that is essentially everybody is going to become their own director. So that to the degree that producer-director was a cultural ideal, we may all approach it. How would that happen? And how do you see it? You mean from all this media? Well, I'm pretty optimistic about all that because I'm sort of influenced by McLuhan and the school of communication theory that he came out of. And his notion was that these technologies based on the phonetic alphabet, specifically and most importantly printing, had really done a job on our psychology and the whole theory of social relations and everything else. And he felt that the electronic media, all of them, radio, television, telephone, and on into the computer and the internet, were retribalizing elements, and that we were actually going to move back into a much less linearly defined and positivist worldview than the historical worldview that had created these technologies. And it seems like this is happening. You know, the rise of the New Age, the fragmentation of epistemology, the cultification and commodification of religion, all of these are cultural effects that McLuhan predicted in the 50s and early 60s in books like The Gutenberg Galaxy and An Understanding Media. Ideally, see, there's a kind of a millenarian cast to all this, because the idea is that somehow advanced technology leads back to a primitive, Edenic psychology. He called it sensory ratio among the senses. And, you know, it would be nice to believe that. I believe it. I mean, I think it's true. What it will actually look like and how Edenic and how neo-primitive it will be. But for sure, a culture based on print is really inhabiting some castle in the sky of abstraction. And you know, the phonetic alphabet in the first place signifies sounds, not signs. So you have one level of alienation and distancing from the object of your intent right there. And then you print, you write it. So now you have a sign for a sound, and then you print it so that it becomes uniform. And this was the point that McLuhan made that a lot of people couldn't immediately grok, was that there was a profound difference between manuscript culture and printed culture, because the uniformity of print permitted ways of thinking that manuscript made impossible. Ideas like the democratic citizen, the interchangeability of parts in an industrial production line. These are all ideas that you couldn't even conceive of without the example of print as a historical precedence. So, you know, my fantasy about all this media and communication stuff is that eventually the human imagination and the world of three-dimensional physics will seamlessly merge in a dimension where human beings are each and all some kind of god, and the imagination and physics can flow together, and the art that is in us intrinsically, that we encounter so dramatically in the psychedelic experience, can actually flow into manifestation. And I don't know whether, you know, this happens in circuitry or 3D, or, I mean, there are many, many dimensions opening ahead of us where our humanness can exfoliate in ways that it can't do in 3D. But this, you know, I wrote a book called The Archaic Revival, which was all about this letdown from the abstraction of print-created history into this post-historical, neo-archaic, electronically based, more magical, more shamanic, more gestalt kind of historical mode. Would I be interested? Would I buy? Well, if you like William Gibson, you should give Greg Egan a try. Neuromancer came out in 1984. How long ago is that? 14 years. Hard to believe. It's a work of ancient history, Neuromancer, a thing of another stratum in the archaeology of the 20th century. Greg Egan, thinking along the same lines, imagines downloads where it's not that you put on goggles and gloves, but that you actually become code. and pushes the reductionist notion of biology that we are code anyway to its logical conclusion, and says, code is code, whether it knows it's code or not. And it may turn out to be true that somehow consciousness can be digitized and exist in some kind of electronic simulacrum of itself. One of the first consequences of that, which is quite interesting, is a funny thing happens to time. Because as we sit here talking, we're running at about 100 hertz. If you could be downloaded into circuitry on a fast machine, say a 400 megahertz machine, 10 minutes is long enough to live your life over several times in all its rich detail, right down to the last Cheerio eaten and the last nose blown. So a weird kind of like synthetic eternity springs into view. You can imagine a world where people, as they approach death, would decide whether, will it be the big D, death, or the little d, digital. And you could buy certain amounts of time in digital existence at the brink of biological death, enough to have your life 10 times over, 1,000 times over, 100,000 times over. And this seems absurd, or maybe it seems absurd. It's closer, I think, than most people realize. I mean, there are questions. It's either closer than most people realize, or it's not possible at all. It has to do with really fundamental questions, like what is the self? What is consciousness? Can we reduce it? Can we play it like an LP record? Can we reduce it to a string of numbers? To what degree is it true that as biological beings, what we are essentially three-dimensional computers? The DNA codes into RNA, which is read through a ribosome. That's like a head reader. It executes a program which makes proteins, and these proteins fold into three-dimensional shapes, and then lo and behold, all these three-dimensional shapes fit together in such a way that you emerge out of the atomic murk of this process. Well, it's our faith that somewhere in there the hand of God has to be extended to make it all go. But there are hardcore materialists who say, that's just romantic nonsense, the sort of romantic nonsense they've been chasing down for centuries and nailing to the barn door, and that a day will come when software will be sentient as you and I are sentient, and where machines of all sorts will routinely pass Turing tests, and other things, lie in the same time frame as that kind of stuff. In Egan's fiction, he's talking 25 to 30 years in the future for downloads of human consciousness into circuitry. He's also talking about artificial life, artificial intelligence, sentient software, software which knows it's software, but which also has some deeper grasp of its existential dilemma somehow. And this whole question, what's happened is we come into the 20th century, or much of the discussion of the 20th century in the sciences was around the working out the implications of the universe viewed as something made out of space, time, matter, energy, magnetic fields, so forth and so on, and the equations for this and the relativistic transforms and all this were worked out. Well, meanwhile, people like Norbert Wiener and what's his name? I can't remember. Well, it will come to me. But Norbert Wiener, the author of Cybernetics primarily, began around 1948 to advance the idea that information was an important concept, and that in fact information could be opposed to the idea of entropy. Entropy was a well-established notion in physics, and was very friendly to schizophrenic existential novel writing of the sort that you get in Gravity's Rainbow. Over the whole last half of Gravity's Rainbow, it's the idea of entropy that basically drives Roger Slothrop around the bend. So thermodynamic entropy, a concept out of physics that basically says everything falls apart. Ultimately, everything, all order gives way to disorder. All unity gives way to disunity. The end state of the universe will be a dark, cold, homogeneous, low energy nothing. But Norbert Wiener and these other people began to talk about information as some kind of countervailing force, and that systems, to be systems, to come into existence and maintain their systemic integrity, had to express themselves through information. And this intuition, was spectacularly confirmed in 1950 when DNA was characterized and they began to understand how it works. And, that these codons are coding for these amino acids, that it's an information conservation and transfer system. And this trend, the informational transformation of the world, has now reached the place where there's been some kind of philosophical ebb of the tide. Information is now primary. Those other concepts, space, time, matter, energy, those are mathematical constructs and metaphors that are themselves states of information. So it's like we've overcome naive realism, which was this space-time matter-energy thing, the belief, that chemistry and physics, and that you could hypothesize an uninvolved observer and actually model based on that assumption and get some worthwhile thing back. All that's given way to this much stickier, trickier, but more grown-up idea that language exists in the world, language is a constant growth of semantic trees toward different kinds of closure under the aegis of these Chomskyan deep structural rules or some other rules similar but not yet known, and that mind is entangled in all of this. That nothing is what it appears to be, and that beneath everything lies this flickering quantum mechanical domain of reverse logic, counterintuitive forms of causal relationships, and that basically the whole thing is a thin smear of paradox, if it's anything at all. So the evolution of technology based on these insights and perceptions reinforces this idea. The theme being here, the rise of the power of the concept of information as a primary datum of being, as the primary datum of being. Well, so then everything turns into digitizable bits, numerically definable flows of data at every level, in biology, in your own body, in computer software generated by human minds that is in the extended culture at large. The whole thing begins to look like a kind of Gnostic descent into matter of an organizing principle that drives it or lifts it toward higher states of organization. And of course, we're part of this. I mean, we're the most spectacular part of this, human beings, human culture, and we're at a spectacular juncture with this, because these machines we're building with 400 megahertz processors and that talk to each other endlessly over the internet, they are literally making time. They are making vast more time than biology could make or occupy. The event rate at which the cascades of biology succeed each other is so slow that in the megahertz range, looking back at that, it's like watching the motion of glaciers or the planets orbiting around the star. So these machines have carved open a new dimension of time, the micro-physical dimension, not travel into the future, but a weird kind of explosive expansion of the now through the conjuring rod of electronic circuitry. And that's just one aspect of what crossing the boundary into machine domains of time and relationships to machine intelligence would offer. But given that the business of the artist is to transform information, all of this is big news. How larger institutions of the culture deal with this is not my interest, but how individuals can, could, and should, in my opinion, deal with it is by really elaborating more compelling forms of art than anybody has ever seen. I mean, that's what we're clearing the decks for, is to really unleash the imagination on previously undreamed of scales. So any thoughts about that, or is that enough of all that?
Well, as someone who's
well, if you liked Photoshop, you should just keep going with, learn to use Premiere, and then there are many modeling programs and animation, and it's endless, as I'm sure you can imagine. But, just mastery of tools. I mean, we all have this idea that we shouldn't learn anything after the age of 30 or something like that. I don't think you can live like that anymore. I mean, I could spend, if somebody would pay me, I could spend all my time learning software, learning to do things better and to bring more control to my art, and the software is endlessly evolving too. I mean, everything seems to be evolving together.